Welcome to Drive the Daf. Clear, structured explanation of the daily Daf in 20 minutes. You can even follow in the car.
Pesachim Daf contains two Mishnayos and three sugyas. From the beginning of the Daf until the first Mishnah has two questions. The Gemara asks about the imurim, the parts of the carbon and Pesach which go on the Mizbeach. One, what happens if it's eaten by Tamei people, and the other, how it was brought on the Mizbeach in Pesach Mitzrayim. Then we get to our first Mishnah, which introduces the topic of Pesach Mitzrayim versus Pesach L'Doros, the carbon Pesach which is brought that year in Mitzrayim, how its halachos compare or are different to the carbon Pesachs brought every year following that for all generations. And the Gemara will have a long list of drashas and rejections of drashas to know where those halachos come from, which ones are the same, which ones are different. This takes us to our second Mishnah, which introduces another Kachim Sugya, the topic of Tmuras Pesach, when you have a carbon Pesach which is not used, or this Kedusha is tempted to be switched to a different animal, when you can bring it as a carbon shlamim, and when you can't bring it as a carbon shlamim. So first of all, the Gemara has, as we said, two shilas about the imurim. Now we know that the halacha is that if the majority of the congregation is tamei, you're allowed to bring the carbon pesach b'toma, and people who are tamei allowed to come into the azara and eat carbon pesach, even though normally those are two isurei kares. Mar's question is, what if they ate the imurim? We know that a tamei person who eats kachim generally, without a right to do so, will get kares for that. Obviously, the exception here is if it's carbon pesach haba b'tama, but that also applies to somebody who eats the imurim of a carbon. He gets kares for that also, even though nobody's ever allowed to eat the imurim. If he eats it when he's tamei, he gets kares for that also. Now, most of the imurim are chelev. If he eats any chelev, he get kares. That's not the issue. But there are some parts, the kidneys and things like that, that are not chelev. It would not be kares for eating them. But the fact that you're tamei and you're eating karbanos makes you chayev kares. Now, the limud that you have kares even for the imurim, not only for the parts of a kachim that is supposed to be eaten, is from the pasuk which says, "Va'nefesh asher tochal basar mizevach hashlamim, asher laHashem v'tamasi olav v'nichos ha'nefeshim me'ameh." That pasuk describes that anybody who eats kachim b'toma gets kares, and it says asher laHashem. The next words asher laHashem means even the parts which are asher laHashem are supposed to go on the mizbeach. You get kares for that generally. The Gemara's question is, what about here? Here, where we say that it's mutter for a tamei person to eat the kachim, is that heter apply only to the parts he's supposed to eat? Or does it even take off the kares from the parts that he's not supposed to eat, which are the imurim? So Gemara brings the drasha of Rava. Rava says, since Asher Lashem has learned out of the pasuk, which is talking about the general isser of a tamei to eat kachim altogether, the two are linked. Only when there's an isser to eat kachim is there a isser kares on the imurim. Once you have the isser coming off of a tamei person eating the regular parts of the carbon, it also takes off the kares part of the imurim being eaten. Okay. The Gemara now says Rabbi Zera has a question. In Mitzrayim, what did they do with the imurim? You're supposed to go on the mizbeach, but there was no mizbeach in Mitzrayim. What did they do with it? So Abaye says, why do you think they did anything with it? They probably roasted it and ate it because there was no mizbeach. There was no place to put it. And a proof to that is that Rabbi Yosef says there were three mizbeachas in Mitzrayim. The blood was put on the doorposts, the two sides of the doorway, and on the top of the doorpost. That's three mizbeachos, but that's only mizbeach for putting the blood. There was no mizbeach for burning the imurim, and therefore you could assume that it was eaten. We now begin the next Mishnah, which compares the halachos of the carbon Pesach brought in Mitzrayim to the carbon Pesach brought every year following that. And the Mishnah lists the differences. And the Gemara will give limudim for all those, for some of the differences, and will also have a long list of attempted limudim, which it will reject for other differences which are not true. So the Mishnah says as follows. The differences are as follows. In Mitzrayim, they had to set aside the carbon on Yud Nisan. They had to designate it specifically as a carbon Pesach 4 days before. Also, they had to take the blood with a bundle of azov, a bundle of herbs or grasses, and they had to use that to paint it on the doorposts. Those two halachas don't apply to Pesach for every generation afterwards. Also, it had to be eaten quickly in one night, while Pesach for all generations could be eaten for all 7 days. Now, that's obviously not true. The Gemara will have to explain what is meant by that line, and the Mishnah isn't meant to be understood the way it sounds. So now the Gemara says, what is the limud, first of all, for this halacha, that you have to set aside, what is the limud for the halacha that you have to set aside carbon Pesach Mitzrayim only for on the 10th of Nisan, and not other Pesachim for all generations do not have to be set aside on the 10th of Nisan. So what the Gemara is going to do here is quote a pasuk which has a very limiting word. It tells you halacha of Pesach Mitzrayim, and it has a word that limits it. So the word here is hazeh. It says this only applies here. It doesn't apply to other carbon Pesachs throughout the years. And then the Gemara is going to ask, there are many other psukim describing many other halachas of carbon Pesach and Mitzrayim that have a limiting word. It could be hazeh, or it could be bai, or it could even be mimenu. All these words limited to only Pesach Mitzrayim. How do we know that it applies, that these halachas do apply to other Pesachim for other years? And the Gemara will say that there's a drasha, the Torah says, that links Avodah Hazais and Chodesh Hazeh, that links the carbon Pesach Mitzrayim to the carbon Pesachim throughout the years, and it teaches that the halachas of one apply to the other. The question then will be, well, then what's the limiting word for? And the Gemara will show that the limiting word is limiting some other halacha. There's some way in which this halacha applies only to carbon Pesach Mitzrayim and not to something else. We're not excluding it from carbon Pesach for generations, we're excluding the halacha from something else. The Gemara will explain each one by one. So first of all, the Gemara says the pasuk which teaches me that in Pesach Mitzrayim you have to set aside the carbon on the 10th of Nisan is Darbal Kol Das Yisrael Leimer Basel Chodesh Hazeh V'Yikchu Lahem Ish Selvei Selvei Set Labai. So it says the Chodesh Hazeh, only this time you have to do it, not other Pesachs that there are out there. So Gemara's first question is, well, we have a different halacha that says you need 4 days to check the carbon Pesach for a mum. Now, these 4 days doesn't necessarily mean you have to designate the carbon 4 days in advance. You could just have a couple of animals that you're checking for a mum, but you got to check it for 4 days. So that halacha you have to check for 4 days, that does apply to other Pesachs for all generations. However, the pasuk that gives you that limud also has the word hazeh. The pasuk says the word mishmeres there teaches me that I have to watch an animal for 4 days. So that does apply to other karbanos Pesachim throughout the years, but the limiting word hazeh is still there. So Gemara says, maybe you'll tell me that you don't have to actually check it for 4 days on other karbanos Pesachim. This is a proof that you do from a brisa. Brisa is quoting Ben Bagbag, who says that even a carbon tamid has to be checked for 4 days. Certainly other karbanos. How do you know the carbon tamid has to be checked for 4 days? Because it uses the word tishmeru describing the carbon tamid. It says Tavaz b'nei Yisrael v'marta aleihem es karbani lachmi l'shayreich nechayach tishmeru lakev liba mayadai. And then about the carbon Pesach, it says limishmeres. Those two are linked, and that teaches me that you do have to check it for 4 days. Both of them need a mishmeres. So back to my kasha. If the word hazeh limits a halacha just to carbon Pesach in Mitzrayim, then this halacha of checking for 4 days should also be limited, and it's not true. The Gemara says, yes, you're right. The reason that it's not true is because the Torah says the Torah links the Pesach Mitzrayim to other Pesachs throughout the years. So Gemara says, very nice. Then what are you going to do with that hazeh? You told me that hazeh limits it. So Gemara says that hazeh is to teach you something else. That hazeh is to teach you that Pesach Sheni does not have this halacha of 4 days of checking in advance. That is what's excluded. It's only Pesach Rishon, whether in Mitzrayim or throughout the years, that has the halacha of setting aside to check for 4 days before. Okay, next, the Gemara now continues on this list. The Gemara asks from the halacha that carbon Pesach has to be eaten at night. It says, so it should be only carbon Pesach Mitzrayim that has that requirement, but others throughout the year should be able to eat for more than that night. The Gemara says, no, again, we have that teaches me that this halacha applies by everything, every year. So the Gemara says, so what does the word hazeh for? The Gemara says hazeh is either like Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah or Rabbi Kiva, as a machlekes which we've seen in Masechas Barachos, Daf Tes. What is that there is a limiting factor to the length of time you're allowed to eat it. According to Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, it's only until chatzos halayla, and according to Rabbi Kiva, it's until sunrise, but it's only for that night, not for the next day, like other karbanos usually are. Okay, Gemara's next kasha is from the halacha that somebody without a bris milah cannot eat. It says, this halacha should apply only to carbon Pesach Mitzrayim and not to other ones. Gemara says, no, again, it says, v'yavadata. Gemara says, so what's the bay for? The bay is to teach you that it's only carbon Pesach that the one without a bris milah can't eat, but he could eat from matzah umar. Okay, Gemara's next kasha is from the halacha that a ben and nechar is not allowed to eat. It says, chol ben nechar lo yechal, bay should only apply to carbon Pesach Mitzrayim. Again, v'yavadata. What's the bay for? The bay is to teach you that this halacha only applies to a carbon Pesach, but it doesn't apply to Truma. So Gemara says, well, Ben Nechar and somebody that Bris Milah are very similar. Why do you need to have both of them? Ben Nechar is somebody who has heretical thoughts in his brain. He doesn't fully believe. He doesn't trust in Hashem. And or somebody who doesn't have a bris milah. So the Gemara says we need them both because we're not sure which is more severe. Bris milah, there's something most, there's something disgusting about the body of the person. He shouldn't eat the carbon because he has a foreskin. Ben Nechar, he's got something rebellious against Hashem in his heart. He's eating, he's not doing the mitzvah for Hashem. So why should he eat the carbon Pesach? Which one of these is worse? We don't know. Therefore, we have to say both of them. Okay, now the Gemara has another step where it asks about a toshav and socher are not allowed to eat it. Rashi rejects this. Rashi takes out this entire question and answer from the Gemara. Rashi says it doesn't make sense. Okay, next halacha is that somebody can't eat from the carbon Pesach if his son or his eved does not have a bris milah. The pasuk there says Umalta Oisei Zyoichal Bay. Once you give him a bris milah, then you can eat Bay. Again, Bay limits it. Should only apply to carbon Pesach Mitzrayim. Where it says no, it says V'yavadata. Which is what's the Bay for? Bay is to teach you that this doesn't apply to Truma. There is no limitation to eating Truma. Only when your entire family has bris milah. Okay, next halacha of etzem le'yishbu. Boy, you're not allowed to break a bone in it. Boy, again, only Pesach Mitzrayim. No, it says v'yavadata. So what's the word boy for? That to teach you that it's only a carbon which is kosher. That doesn't issur to break the bones. If the carbon's puzzle, there's no issur. A sugya which we've seen at length early in the Masechta on Daf Ayin. Next, Gemara says lo mimenu. No, you can't eat from it raw. So here, mimenu is the limiting word. It should only apply to Pesach Mitzrayim. Then you have to eat it roasted and not raw. There's also to eat it raw. Gemara says no. Again says v'yavadata. Gemara says what's mimenu? So the Gemara here says the word mimenu is to teach you the drasha of Rabbi Yitzchak that links meiser to carbon Pesach through the word mimenu. It's a heke. It's a gzera of the word mimenu. Both of them only are allowed to be eaten by people who have a bris milah. Okay, the Gemara now moves on to the other halachos which were said in the Mishnah. The first one is that you have to eat it quickly. Bichipazoin, says the Gemara, how do you know that it's only Pesach Mitzrayim, has to be eaten in a rush? So the Gemara says, it says, bichipazoin, oisai limits it, only it has to be eaten in a rush, not other carbonei Pesach throughout the years. Alright, now next, the Mishnah had said that the halacha is that the carbon Pesach Mitzrayim is only eaten one night, while Pesach of all the years is eaten throughout 7 days. The Gemara says it's obviously not true. What's it referring to? The Gemara says it's referring to the Isser Chametz. It's asur to eat chametz all 7 days through every year, but a mitzvah is only asur for that one night. The Gemara says it's not true. That was only that one night. It was that night and the next day. How do you know that? Brisa, Rabbi Yisrael Glili, says lo yechal chametz, and right afterwards it says hayom atem yaitzim, teach you that the Isser Chametz applies the whole hayom, the whole day. So the Gemara says you have to do is split our Mishnah into two phrases. One phrase says that carbon Pesach Mitzrayim and Pesach for all the years are the same as far as the time of eating the Pesach, that it's only that night. As far as chametz, there's a difference. Carbon Pesach Mitzrayim was only for the first day, and Pesach for all generations was for 7 days afterwards. Okay, now we start our next Mishnah, which takes us to the halachos of Karbani Pesach, which don't end up being brought. What happens with them? So generally the rule is that any carbon Pesach which isn't brought as a carbon Pesach reverts to a shlamim. A Pesach is a specific type of carbon shlamim. If it can't be brought as a Pesach, that expires and it just becomes a shlamim. You can bring it as a shlamim. Now, sometimes the Pesach itself is disqualified to the extent that you can't actually take that animal and offer it as a shlamim. You have to convert it into money. How do you do that? You wait until it gets a mum. Once it gets a mum, it's not with the Kedushas HaGuf anymore. It itself doesn't have Kedushas Mizbeach to go on the Mizbeach. It just has Kedusha and its value. You can take that value, swap it onto money, take that money, buy a different carbon, and bring that as a shlamim. That would be in a situation where there's something wrong. We can't allow you to bring this carbon on the Mizbeach itself. What's that situation? So the Gemara says, as we shall see soon, that's when you had the Pesach, it was available to be brought, and it was rejected. For some reason, you did not bring it, even though it was present. Now, the types of situations in which you have extras, which we will discuss, are if your carbon Pesach was lost and you brought another one, and then you found the first one, now you have two. So, the second one, the first one, which was lost and is now found, that one is extra. Another situation is if you do Tumura, that is, if you take a carbon Pesach and you say I'm swapping the Kedusha onto a different animal. As long as it has Kedusha's Mizbech, you're definitely not allowed to do that. What ends up happening is that both become Kodesh and both need to be brought as a carbon. It can't be a Pesach, then it could be a Shlomim. So in what situations are you allowed to bring the carbon itself as a shlamim? Are you allowed to bring this animal as a shlamim? And what situations are you not allowed to bring this animal as a shlamim? You have to wait until it gets a mum, transfer its kedusha to money, and then take that money and buy different animals for it. So the Gemara, the Mishnah says, Rabbi Yeshua says, I heard sometimes a carbon Pesach is brought, sometimes a tamura, he says. Sometimes a tamura of a carbon Pesach is brought, sometimes it's not brought, you have to switch it to money and then to a different animal, and I don't know which one is which. Rabbi Kiva said it's as follows. It depends if it was hudcha or not hudcha. It depends if the second animal, the animal which is extra, was around at the time of shechita and was not brought, even though it was present, or if it was lost at the time of shechita. If what happened is that you had a carbon Pesach and you lost it, and then you brought another one and you shechted it, and then later you found the first carbon at the time of shechita, the first carbon wasn't present. You didn't reject it, you just didn't know where it was. Therefore, it's not rejected. It's not rejected. You could bring it itself as a carbon shlamim. If, however, the time you lost the carbon and then you found it, and now you had two carbonis, meaning you lost it, you set aside another one as a carbon Pesach, then you found the first one, now you have two. You can only bring one. You chose one of them, you rejected the other one. That's a specific rejection. A rejected carbon can't be brought even as a shlamim. You have to wait till it gets a mum, transfer its kedusha to money, then buy a different animal, and bring it that way. Now, Gemara asks that this is very nice, and Rabbi Kiva even says that this applies not only to the carbon itself, but even to a tamura of the carbon. But the Gemara says, why are we talking about a tamura then? The way Rabbi Yeshua quoted this halacha was that I heard that some tamurais Pesach are brought and some aren't. According to Rabbi Kiva's explanation, the same halacha applies to the Pesach itself. It also applies to the tamura, but it also applies to the Pesach itself. Why did we mention tamura only? The Gemara answers the reason why Rabbi Yeshua was speaking about Tamura was to teach me that there is a concept of a Tamuras Pesach that has been rejected. You may think a Tamuras Pesach is never really meant to be brought as a carbon. It's never even fitting to be brought. It always has to be exchanged. It always ends up being a shlamim. So therefore it was never qualified as a Pesach, and therefore it can't be rejected to the point that you can't bring it as a carbon. You have to transfer its kedusha to money and then to another animal. Comes to teach you that there is a Tamuras Pesach which is rejectable. Okay. It's rejectable. It counts enough as a carbon Pesach itself that if you didn't bring it, it's rejectable, and therefore you would have to only transfer its kedusha to a different animal via money after it gets a mum. Okay, now the Gemara begins. The Gemara calls a machlokas between Rabbah and Rabbi Zera. What is the moment at which a Pesach which is around is rejected? Is it the moment of shechita of a different carbon, or is it the moment of chatzos? As soon as it is chatzos and it's time for the carbon Pesach to be brought and it doesn't end up ever getting brought, it would reject it. The difference is if the animal was found after chatzos but before the other carbon was actually slaughtered. According to Rabbah, it's got to be around by shechita for it to be rejected. In that case, it would not be considered rejected. According to Rabbi Zera, it's chatzos that does it, and it was around at chatzos and it was never brought, it's rejected, even though it wasn't around at the time of shechita of the other animal. So Gemara says that this actually is a machlokas tanayim. Rabbi Elazar says that it's chatzos, and the Tanakama in a brisa says that it is shechita. All right, now the Gemara has another statement of Rabbah in which he limits, he specifics, he qualifies the halachos in our Mishnah. But there's two versions of what Rabbah was referring to, and the kashas that Abaye asked on him. In one, he's referring to one side of the halacha, the case in which it's not rejected, and one is referring to the side of halacha in which it is rejected, and he's limiting how it applies to tamura. So the first version is that Rabbah was referring to the situation in which the tamura is allowed to be brought as a shlamim. Now, when did we say that the carbon is allowed to be brought as a shlamim? The carbon Pesach itself, if it was not around at the time of shechita and it wasn't rejected, and the tamur would be the same thing. So all the Mishnah says is that the tamur is the same thing. The question is, when did the tamura become tamura? When did he try to move kedusha onto another animal and rope that one into the kedusha and give it kedusha shlamim? When did it happen? So Rabbah says it's got to be that it happened before the shechita which rejected this carbon Pesach. Meaning, what happened? You lost a carbon Pesach, you brought another one, then you shechted another one, then you found the first one. So this one is not rejected. Then you took this animal and you made tamura. So that tamura is also not rejected, and you could bring that also as a carbon shlamim. If, however, says Rabbah, you lost an animal, you brought another one, you have that one, you didn't shecht it yet, you found the first one, now you have both of them. You shecht, let's say, the second one that you set aside, and therefore the first one is rejected, and now you do Tamura. Says Rabbah, in this case, you cannot bring that Tamura either, because the Tamura, even if that Tamura was not around at the time of rejection, but that Tamura comes from a rejected animal. It's a Tamura of a rejected Kedusha. Since it's a rejected Kedusha, it itself can never be brought as a Shlamim. It has to wait until it gets a mum, be sold, and have the money buy a new animal. Now, Abaye has kashas on this. Abaye has the Torah, when it describes a Shlamim, has an extra phrase, im kesef. Now, it's not clear which word is extra. Rashi says they could both theoretically be extra, and the Gemara seems to consider them both extra, because it gives drashas later for both of them. But in describing their shlamim, first it says im tzayin, if it will be sheep, and then later it specifies which tzayin. So tzayin could be a kesev, which is a sheep, or a eiz, a goat. Tzayin is a general word for the two of them. And then it says im kesev, and then later it says im eiz. Why do you have to say both of them? You could just say im eiz, and I would know that the other one you're talking about is kesev. Additionally, you didn't have to say im. You could just say kesev. So both words could potentially be extra. So Abaye says, what is this for? This is, he quotes a brisa. What is the phrase, the extra im or the extra kesev, what is this for? To teach you that a tmuras pesach, an animal which was a tmura for a carbon pesach, could itself be brought as a carbon shlamim. Says Abaye, what are we referring to? Tmura of an animal which was not rejected? So what's a chiddush? Of course it could. We know the halacha that any extra shlamim or tmura shlamim is brought as a carbon shlamim. That's taught from a totally different pasuk elsewhere. V'zavachta, has nothing to do with this. What is this extra phrase you're teaching me? It must be teaching me that even if it's a tamura of an already rejected animal, the tamura itself is not rejected, and therefore the tamura could be brought. It doesn't have to have its kedusha exchanged to something else and then bring that. So Gemara says Rabbi will defend himself, and Rabbi says no. Really, this is not a drasha. This is just an asmachta. It's just a hint. It's a clue that the Torah gives us that there is a carbon which could be brought. And we're not talking about where it was a rejected carbon that was made into Tumura. We're talking about where it was not rejected. And the Torah is not teaching it to me here. That's learned from elsewhere, like you said. It's just, this is another hint to that halacha that you could have a transferring carbon be brought as a shlamim. You could have a Tumura be brought as a shlamim. And it's not chas v'shalom referring to where it was from a rejected carbon, because that can't be brought. Asks the Gemara, what then are the words im or kesev? What are they teaching me? The Gemara says that they are teaching me that a carbon pesach which ends up being a shlamim, either because it got too old, or because there's some other reason that it wasn't brought, that it has a lot of the halachas of a regular shlamim. You have to do smicha, you have to bring the sachim, you have to wave the chazav v'shaik in all directions. A lot of those halachas apply. That is included in the phrase im kesev. Now, another thing that I learned from it, because again there's two extra words, is kesev and im, is that the aliyah, the tail of a carbon pesach, is considered a murim, and it goes in the mizbeach. This is a chiddush. Generally, the Torah always, when it discusses a murim, mentions the ayah specifically. Carbon pesach, it doesn't discuss the murim at all. It doesn't say what they are. So therefore, we have to have a lima to teach me it's the ayah as well. Now, the aliyah is true only for sheep. It doesn't apply by goats. By goats, the aliyah is not a murim. It does not go on the mizbeach, and therefore it has to say im, eiz. Again, to block the halacha from before. The halacha which we said that the aliyah applies is only from im kesev, but it does not apply by im eiz. That ends that original discussion and says that the next one will not have that halacha of aliyah. Okay, this is the entire first version of Rabba's discussion. Now the second version is that Rabba was referring to the other half of the Mishnah, which said that if the carbon pesach is found before shchita and both carbonei Pesach are around at the time of Shechita, the one that's not used is rejected and cannot be brought as a shlamim. It has to have its kedusha transferred. And the Mishnah had added, and the same thing applies to its Tamura. On that, Rabbah said, Tamura when? When was this Tamura made? Was it made before the carbon was rejected by the Shechita of the other, or after it was rejected by the Shechita of the other? Says Rabbah, it's got to be that it was before it was rejected by the shechita of the other, so that tamura is around. At the time of shechita, at the time that it rejects the carbon, it also rejects its tamura. It's got to be tamura already. If it became tamura later, it can't be rejected. The fact that it became tamura of a rejected carbon, we do not say. This is the opposite of what he said before. We do not say you're tamura of an already rejected carbon, therefore you're rejected yourself. The tamura has to be existing as tamura at the time of rejection in order for it to be included. The Gemara says, Abaye asked a kasha. We have a brisa that learns a drasha from the words im kesef. The drasha is that a tamura of a carbon pesach could be brought as a shlamim after Pesach, and it can't be brought as a shlamim before Pesach or on Pesach. It has to be after Pesach that it can be brought as a shlamim. Says Abai, what's the chiddush when you tell me that the tamur can't be brought before Pesach or on Pesach? If it's referring to where the tamur was already made at the time of rejection and the tamur was rejected as well, that's pashut. I don't need you to teach me that. Must be referring to where the tamur was made after rejection and is teaching me that a rejected animal also rejects its tamura, which is against Rava. The Gemara concludes that this is a solid kasha on Rava and changes the girsa to Rava.
Drive the Daf is a project of the Grand Woodlands Shul and is presented by Rabbi Yitzchak Landa. Find us on YouTube or subscribe to daily emails by emailing drivethedaf@gmail.com.